Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Elite Geeks Tech Podcast. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the intersections of technology, culture, and storytelling in the gaming world, exploring an often overlooked but crucial aspect of game development, culturalization. It's not just about translating language, but about adapting content to resonate culturally across global markets. A little bit of light housekeeping. Here we go. We're going to do our intro.
From the heart of Silicon Valley, San Jose, California, and broadcast worldwide. Velocity 7 Studios and Team V7 are proud to present the Elite Geeks Podcast. Stay tuned for an impactful lowdown featuring today's most incredible change makers. Now, here's your host, Roland Bow.
Welcome back. Yes, we have some light housekeeping before we introduce our guest today. First, I'd like to introduce my co-host who's joining us today. Her name is Eileen Mazina. Welcome, Eileen.
Hello, Ro. How are you today?
Doing good. So Eileen has a career spanning over a decade. She's a powerhouse in the world of business, aviation, and technology, which has some interesting cross sections with today's particular episode. She brings a wealth of experience and passion for excellence in everything that she does. Has a career over a decade, made her mark in various industries from startups to multinational corporations. Her versatility and adaptability have allowed her to thrive in a lot of roles ranging from administration and operations all the way to project management and even customer support. But what really sets Eileen apart is her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Fluent in 5 languages. That's right. 5 languages. Yeah. She has a gift for building those bridges and fostering meaningful relationships in all kind of multicultural environments. Whether she's coordinating a flight, planning an event, leading a team, Eileen brings a level of empathy, respect, and communication that is truly remarkable. So a big thanks to Eileen for embodying that spirit of the Elite Geeks community with her diverse background, infectious enthusiasm, commitment to quality. Eileen's sure to bring a fresh perspective and valuable insight to what we do here. And with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome, Eileen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
What an introduction. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Is there anything you'd like to share with the audience about yourself or anything other than the things that I just said? How about the fact that you live in Buenos Aires, Argentina, which is an amazing place, as you tell me all the time?
Yeah, sure. I'm living in Argentina, Buenos Aires. I lived all my life here. I love my country. Well, it's a little bit sometimes weird to live here, South America, but it's challenging and amazing because people here, it's so warm. So I love
Interesting that we have a guest today whose specialization is cultural and globalization, and we have a host from two different parts of the Western Hemisphere here. Well, anyway, with that, I'd like to get to our guest, who is somebody that I met a little while ago at a fun event and was just so impressed with them. Basically, joining us today is a titan in the field. Her name is Kate Edwards. She spent over 30 years as a geographer, a culturalization strategist. Kate's been instrumental in shaping narratives and environments in iconic games like Halo, Mass Effect, and ensuring that they strike that right chord with audiences worldwide. She's an award-winning advocate, speaker, advisor, mentor, geographer, and culturalization innovator. She's the CEO and principal consultant at Geography LLC, a company that she founded back in 2005. She's also the co-founder and chief experience officer at SetJetters, which is a fun app we're going to talk about at the end. Kate Edwards has held several leadership roles in video game industry, including serving as the executive director of the International Game Developers Association from 2012 to 2017, and is the director and executive director of the Global Game Jam from 2019 to 2022. She's received numerous awards and honors for her work, including being inducted into the Mobile Growth Association Hall of Fame, the Women in Games Hall of Fame, and being named to the Forbes 50 Over 50 Vision list. She is a chartered geographer and has worked as a geopolitical strategist and senior advisor for great big giant tech companies like Microsoft. Thank you so much, Kate. Today, she's here to share her invaluable insights with us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the generous introduction. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Well, let me just kind of give our audience an overview of the episode. In this episode, we're going to cover everything from the basics of culturalization to its challenges and triumphs. We'll explore some of Kate's particular role in revolutionizing how game developers think about those global audiences, and conclude with some Q&A sessions where Kate can answer some of our burning questions. All right, give me 1 second. So our first segment, we're going to be talking, already had our welcome. So we're going to be talking about understanding culturalization. So let's start at the foundation, Kate. Can you explain to us what exactly culturalization is in your view and why it's so much more than just simple translation?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically what happens when we create content for global markets, which is pretty much every piece of content that's ever made today, what typically happens in the past is that people, they would generate, let's say, a piece of software, like in my days at Microsoft back in the 90s and early 2000s, where you make a product like Microsoft Excel or Word, and of course you want it to be compatible with other countries and other cultures. So you localize it, which means you do language translation. So all the UI and all the text, of course, is localized into the local language. And that's been pretty standard for software for decades now, and including games, because games are software as well. But what we find is that especially with games, because they are such a broader, more immersive experience, it's not just about using a spreadsheet or writing a letter or something. It's a whole world that you're going to experience. There's a lot of elements inside that world that may or may not be compatible with the different cultures. So it's not just about legibility through language translation. Now it's about how do the ideas within this world and the characters and the factions and the narrative and everything else that goes into the world building, how does all of that kind of translate, so to speak, not language translation, but culturally translate into another culture, and make sure that the ideas that we want to convey and the story that we're trying to tell is actually going to be understood at a fundamental level in these other cultures. And so that's really where culturalization comes in. It's looking beyond just the language aspect and all the other things that are in the environment, which you can imagine in a game, because it's a world that's being built. It's like everything: character design, buildings, environments,
All of the above, the clothing,
symbols, et cetera, et cetera.
the architecture, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was a great overview. It's clear to me that culturalization is kind of an essential thing, especially the bigger and more global scope you're trying to have. Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into what it means to work as a culturalization strategist. So I know that that's kind of the work that you do a lot of. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your role.
Yeah, so my role, just so people have a little bit of background about how this even happened, because this is not a standard role. You don't find many culturalization strategists out there at all. So basically, as a geographer, I went into Microsoft way back in 1992 as a cartographer to make the maps on Encarta Encyclopedia, which some people might remember Encarta back in the 90s. A lot of people grew up with it. I worked on Encarta Encyclopedia.
I remember Encarta.
Yay! For people who don't know, Encarta was essentially the last digital encyclopedia before Wikipedia showed up online. So it was a hard media, CD-ROM, DVD that they would ship with Windows and other software. And a lot of people had it as a resource when they were growing up. And so I made all the maps for Encarta way back in 1992. And I thought it was just going to be a quick, 6-month contract and then I'm done. But then they renewed the contract and had me work on other stuff there, and eventually offered me a full-time position at the company, where they basically said, hey, just write the job description and we'll hire you into the role. And what they wanted me to do, yeah, that's the good old days. You don't really see that happen much anymore. But what they wanted me to do was basically be the geopolitical strategist for Microsoft. And what that entailed was basically on all the mapping products that were being made, because Microsoft was making a huge push into different mapping products back then. They needed somebody to help them navigate all the complexities of how do you show Taiwan, and how do you show the disputed area of Kashmir, northern India, and how do you show all these other parts of the world that are tricky when you're trying to sell into different markets. And I could do that. That was part of my background as a cartographer and geographer. So I found that pretty easy to do. And so that was my first job at Microsoft, but eventually it evolved into doing a lot more because I was getting questions from all over the company about all kinds of things. Like, is this gesture okay? Is this flag correct? You know, all that kind of stuff. In fact, I had an internal alias at Microsoft called Dr. Ware. So I was Dr. Ware at Microsoft, where people could just send internal queries to Dr. Ware and get all kinds of geography questions answered. And eventually what happened is we had this whole thing happen between Incarnate World Atlas and then Age of Empires that happened way back in 1997 that really it was a flare up of sensitivities with the South Korean government, which I don't have time to go. That's a whole hour in itself to explain that whole story. But suffice to say, it gave me the idea to create a new kind of team at Microsoft that I called geopolitical strategy to effectively help the company avoid making political and cultural mistakes across all of their content, including all the games that they were starting to work on back then. And so that team eventually got created in 1998, and I basically managed that effort until I left in 2005 and created an internal process to effectively help all the Microsoft products basically be compatible with different markets culturally and geopolitically, not just from a localization standpoint. And that's essentially how I started working on games, because that team and that mission gave me the mandate to work on all Microsoft products. And being a huge geek myself and being a lifelong gamer, because Pong was my first game, because that's how old I am. You know, for me, I found my perfect calling. Doing culturalization work on games was like the absolute best thing I could ever hope for. And that's essentially how I got into it. And so I essentially defined what a culturalization strategist does. And so without that prelude, to answer your question, a culturalization strategist, essentially what you do is you work alongside the people creating these worlds. And I say worlds, meaning it doesn't just have to be a game world. It can also be the world of information that is in a product like Microsoft Excel or Google Maps or whatever it is, because every one of these experiences is an information space. It's an information world that we are creating and presenting to the user, where there are certain expectations of user behavior, as well as things that we're presenting in a certain UI and user experience that essentially is guiding them on how we want them to perceive something. And that's really where I come in, and where a culturalization strategist is useful, is to help them understand, well, how do people across different locales perceive things? Because it's not going to be perceived universally, even though, yes, we're all human, and the faculties we have, the physicality we have to perceive things is pretty much the same. But beyond that, there's all the layers of culture and upbringing and all the other things that influence how we actually perceive things. And that's where I come into play.
Makes sense. You know, it sounds like understanding all the nuances that come with different cultures and geography and like all of that seems like such a big, giant, complex process to me. And I've heard you give presentations at events, and like I'm just always like, wow, like all the stuff that you've got to be thinking about. It's like so massive of just a subject matter. With that in mind, like that's the how, that's the you know, the role. You know, we can move to the what. So let's talk about maybe some of the specific challenges that you've faced in the role, different projects, anything that you might want to share. I mean, it sounds like navigating a minefield to me. So what are some common issues that your teams encounter, or any anecdotes, you know, you might be able to share?
Yeah, well, I've got many anecdotes. I would start by saying the biggest challenge of doing this job is the fact that you're dealing with very sensitive topics. And for most people who are working on a game or working on a piece of software or something, that's not the kind of discussion you're normally going to have in the office. Or, you know, is like, hey, let's talk about the politics of this particular location and what's going to happen in the next election and how that's going to influence the reception of the product that we're trying to get out the door. Or let's talk about how this faith system is different from this faith system and how that's influencing the perception of a certain character that's in our game. You know, those kind of topics are the kind of thing, at least in like, you know, a lot of workplaces, is like, yeah, we don't talk about politics and religion and all that, you know, because of the nature of where those discussions can often go. But that is the whole point of my work, is that I have to talk about those things, and we have to be very explicit. And essentially that's a lot of what this whole process is about. It's making explicit these things that we know a lot of us are thinking about when we're designing a character or designing a game or a world or something. We're kind of have it maybe in the back of our heads that this could be an implication, like, okay, I'm going to design this character who's based on a certain culture, and the clothing that they're wearing has religious implications, but I don't really want that to be conveyed with the character because they're not from that religion, but I still want to use the look that they're using. So now you're starting to build up these potential issues of like, well, now you're essentially building an allegory with a character that looks like they're from a certain culture, but you don't want them to be from that culture. But then how do you separate them? How do you make sure
from the reality, I guess?
Yeah, and that's a concept that I call allegorical distance, where basically you're trying to separate the in-game implementation from the real-world inspiration, because pretty much everything that goes into a game, or pretty much any media today, is inspired by the real world.
Yes.
That's where we get our inspiration as artists and writers, and all the other things that all of our experience we have from travel and everything. And so how do we make sure that as we go through the process of creation, are we being very mindful of the influences that we have over the art that we're creating? And that intentionality with the creation process is one of the biggest challenges in this work, because I will go to an artist, let's say, when they're working on a design of something, and I'll have to point out to them and say, hey, I hate to tell you this, but what you've just created, there's a really big potential problem here. This is a issue of cultural appropriation, or it's an issue of allegory problem or something. And oftentimes the reaction I will get tends to be negative, because it's like, hey, it's my creative work. Who are you to criticize my creative work? And I'm like, I'm not criticizing your creative work. Your creative ability is phenomenal. It's really amazing. But I'm saying that the decisions you're making around the design are basically treading into a territory where you're starting to, maybe it might be cultural appropriation, and that's something they may not be aware of. And that's part of the role, is essentially, and I've actually had some of the clients I work with call me their Jiminy Cricket, where I'm kind of sitting on their shoulder, saying, hey, I don't think you should do it that way. Just to be like an objective third party that's kind of looking at the process, and I'm not completely attached to the world that's being created. So I'm more objective about it, to basically just say, hey, this looks great, but here's a couple things that we could tweak in order to make sure that the design is not perceived in a way that you don't intend. And so there's a lot of those kinds of conversations that take place. So sometimes they're really easy, they're very surgical in nature, and other times they're much more complicated than that. I can give you an example, actually, and I'm going to try and show you this example. So I can just go here and find it, and because I think this is a really good illustration of one of the a simple thing where people might just not even really think about it. So I will just show you this real quick. So in this example here that I'm showing is from a game called Pocket God that came out quite a while ago. It's one of the earlier full-fledged games on the iPhone. And what you see here is just this nice little island. And you see these little indigenous people who are populating the island. And now this game was getting criticism for two reasons. One is the depiction of the indigenous people, because it is a very antiquated view of an indigenous person, with the top knot and with the bone in the hair, and they look kind of animal-like with little sharp pointy teeth and everything. But what makes this even more problematic is the fact that you can essentially kill these people in all kinds of creative ways, which was the point of the game, because you're the pocket god. And so you can cause the volcano to explode, you can dangle them over the water and have sharks eat them, and et cetera, et cetera. So this game started getting a lot of pushback from people in the Polynesian community saying, hey, why are you picking on us? Why are you making a game about us, and not only depicting us this way, but treating us this way? And the game developer said, well, hey, this has nothing to do with you. It's a fictional little game. However, you can see that object on the right side of the island. That's a moai, and the moai exists only in one place which is Easter Island.
Right. Yeah.
And so
points directly to a culture, points directly to
exactly
a location. Right.
So by using that cultural artifact, they instantly made this game about that culture, which is why in the subsequent versions of the game, they actually swapped out the Moai for something more fictional.
Nice, more generic.
Yeah, but they didn't do anything about the indigenous depiction, unfortunately. But that's an example of the kind of thing that we often have to deal with. So a lot of the work that I do is very surgical like that. It's not like looking at the entire game and saying, oh my God, this whole concept is very flawed. That has happened a couple of times, but for the most part, this work tends to be very, very surgical. You're looking like for one thing that needs to be changed or one other element, that might need to be swapped out. And I actually have another example of that if you want to hear it, which is deals with Halo.
That'd be great. Yes. Any insider non-NDA blocking information you can share is lovely for us to learn about.
Yeah, no, this example has been out in the world for it's been out there for quite a while. So let me just bring this up again. So it just takes a moment to share. So here we go. So this example, this character, if people haven't played Halo, I'm going to have to set it up just briefly. So, basically it's a sci-fi universe, takes place several centuries in the future. This character serves, he's part of a group called the Covenant. And the Covenant is like a quasi-religious alien group that's led by 3 leaders, one of whom they're all called prophets, and one of them, the prophets, is called the Prophet of Truth, which is an often used synonym for Muhammad. So I flagged that and said, well, that could be potentially problematic. But the bigger problem is that this character's original name, it was Dervish. And the title Dervish is actually from Sufi Islam. It's very specific to Sufi Islam, even though I know in colloquial English, we'll often say the whirling dervish is kind of like,
right.
But that comes from Sufi Islam. It's a practice from that particular sect of Islam. And so dervish is specific to that sect in the same way that Pope is very specific to Roman Catholicism. And so by using dervish for this character, the dervish is serving the Prophet of Truth, and who runs the Covenant. And what is the Covenant's goal? They, like I said, they're a quasi-religious group, and their goal is to activate these 7 Halo rings, these giant structures, which are essentially WMDs that are going to destroy all sentient life across the galaxy. And who's trying to stop them? This super soldier with an American accent, the Master Chief.
Marine-looking, iconography.
Exactly.
Right.
So, and all of his comrades have American accents and everything. And so you've got this American super soldier who's the hero of the game, who's trying to stop this religious covenant group, the Dervish and the Prophet of Truth, from activating these WMDs. And this is the largest game title that's coming out shortly after 9/11 from Microsoft. And it's got a lot of attention on it because Halo, of course, is extremely famous, and it helped launch the Xbox platform in 2001, the original Halo game. And so I felt that the use of the term dervish was setting up an allegory that we really did not want to convey. And I actually tested the allegory with some of my colleagues in the Middle East region when I was working at Microsoft, and said, "What do you see anything here?" And without flinching, some of them said, "Yeah, this is a revenge fantasy of the United States against Islam for 9/11." I'm like, okay, that's what I suspected as well,
right.
And that is definitely not what we want people
what they
to
want to
perceive.
convey. Right.
So this was another example of being very surgical, and essentially I told the team we need to change one thing, and that's the name Dervish, and that's why this character was eventually called the Arbiter rather than the Dervish. And I thought the Arbiter was a much better name for the character and their role in the narrative. But it was a long process of having that changed for all kinds of internal pushback reasons. But eventually the name did get changed, and it got to the point where I felt that now we're not really setting up the allegory as obviously. I mean, some people could ask, well, why didn't you change Prophet of Truth? I'm like, well, because that is defensible. You could argue that term could be used for many different religious figures, not just for Muhammad.
Right.
But dervish is too specific to Islam, and that's why I felt that one had to be changed.
Makes
So
sometimes it seems like it's about advising compromise, like not, hey, you have to change every little detail, but okay, these are the most impactful details,
Yes.
or the most, I guess impactful is the word that maybe we could use. Okay, well,
Well, it's really, and that's really what it's about. I mean, it is a negotiation because my goal is to preserve their creative vision. I do not want to trample on the amazing work that they've done. I just want to make sure that their amazing work is going to be enjoyed by as many people as possible. And sometimes the teams I work with don't really see it that way. They just see me as this thoughtless ogre who wants to destroy their game world, and it's like that's not the case.
Understood. Well, like I said earlier, like I think I used the term minefield. It feels like it can be a minefield, both for you and, of course, for the developer that's just playing in the space. But negotiating that, it's like for both.
Mhm.
So those stories really highlight the delicate balance, I think, that your role requires, or that I guess culturalization requires. On a brighter note, though, we can talk about maybe some success stories where culturalization has enhanced a game's global appeal. Do you have any examples like where maybe it wasn't that there was a problem, but a decision was made and it made something blow up, or anything of that nature? Do you have anything like that?
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
there's a lot of things that have happened where I can't talk about them because
okay,
they never became public domain. But
I
I
got you.
can't but I can give you an example. Because it's what I call proactive culturalization. So this is a process of looking for ways to basically enhance the experience for a certain market or for a specific demographic if we feel that there's basically that's the goal of the company and the goal of the team. And so I'll show you this one example right now. This is from the game Temple Run 2 that I worked on. And so what they were seeing was a strong interest in Mexico, for example, and more active players in Mexico who were playing the game. And they said, well, hey, what if we did a special live ops around Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead holiday, which is a very significant event in Mexico. And so we said we can dress up the environment in a way that makes it respectful of the holiday, using like the marigolds and the calaveras, the photos of the past relatives and the candles and whatnot, and put those throughout the environment. And then we also changed the two avatars, the male and female avatar, so that they represent people from that culture. And that's what we did, obviously working with people from that culture to make sure that we were doing it correctly and respectfully. And so we went ahead and released this version of the game specifically for Mexico for that holiday. And it was wildly popular. It's just the sales did a huge spike and people thought this was super cool. It was actually a light touch. They didn't have to do a massive amount of overhaul of the environment. They just kind of added some layers to it to kind of dress it up here and there. And it had a huge positive response. And so it was actually so popular that the team did another version for the Holi holiday, the Festival of Colors in India, and they saw a similar very positive response. And so we are looking for ways, often that how can the experience, it's not just about the negative stuff and making sure that, we don't cause an offense, which is, tends to be the majority of what I'm asked to do. That's what I call reactive culturalization.
Gotcha.
But there are a lot of times where we can, make little changes that actually makes the experience a lot better. Sometimes it's really blatant, like this, making a version for Mexico, but oftentimes it's something much more subtle. It could be something like for example, when I worked on the Dance Central games, my job with the Dance Central games was looking for body language and gestures that could be potentially problematic. So there goes my virtual background. So the gestures and the body language as you're dancing, because in the Dance Central game, you're following the avatar and they're dancing around. And so the gestures, of course, can be very culturally specific, like extremely culturally specific. And we don't want to make that a problem. And so, for example, there's one dance where a character's doing this gesture, which is, for most people say that's rock on.
Right.
It's the rock and roll gesture, unless you're from Texas, which you probably say it's hook 'em
Or the
horns.
Bible Belt, Georgia.
Georgia.
My upbringing, I don't think it's today, but my upbringing had a very
Yeah.
different interpretation of the goat and
Yeah, exactly. But in
hell and satanic stuff. And yeah, no, I definitely
exactly.
understand all that sort of thing.
which is why it became associated with rock and roll. But
Makes sense.
but in Italy, it's called the cornuta, which actually means I'm sleeping with your wife. So that's something like you flash at
even
somebody.
worse.
So
Here in Argentina, it's the same.
yeah. So there you
Yes,
go.
it's the same.
Is that why your eyes were getting big there off camera?
Yes.
Well, just like I gave a lecture at Facebook headquarters a few years back where I had to point out to them that their corporate gesture is the middle finger in some countries. So, we have to be
Yeah.
so looking at things like that, and just kind of seeing, what works and doesn't work in different cultures. And like one of the things that happened was in the early versions of the game, the character, when the dance would end, the avatar on the screen would always kind of do this. And they'd kind of like hold their pose like this. Well, doing that gesture is called the mozza in Greece, which is the same as the middle finger. And so you don't want to like flash your hand like that. Sorry, anyone in Greece. But
Noted.
so then they said, well, okay, we won't do this. We'll have them point instead. I'm like, no, you can't do that because pointing is a problem in Asia, especially East Asia. You don't point at people. It's actually a problem in several countries and regions. And they said, well, then we'll just do a fist like this. And I said, okay, you can do a fist, like just a closed fist. Don't put it up like this because that's called the power fist. And that has other connotations. So make sure it's forward like this. And you're fine.
Wow.
Like I said, it feels like a minefield.
Wow.
But it's
Yeah.
amazing that you have that encyclopedic knowledge to like how, one of the questions I'm going to ask later is how do you develop that encyclopedic knowledge? So don't answer now. In fact, right now, I think we're going to take a quick little break. And if you want, you can go fix your screen.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back in just a minute. We'll pick it right back up. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. We got our little technical glitch there taken care of. Before we went to that break, we were talking about wins, or I guess more specifically, success stories in culturalization. So it was really inspiring to hear how those thoughtful culturalization thoughts and projects and perspectives can lead to some worldwide success, especially there in Mexico. I know, a little side note, we love Temple Run very much, so much we bought the board game because we love the app so much. And I'm almost upset because it being Mexico based, I never got to see that cool version of it. But I'm really glad that it had success there in Mexico. Because I think global reach isn't just about good business, right? It's about making meaningful connections with your products, with the communities, with the people. So I'm wondering, let's explore maybe how those efforts impact maybe marketability and acceptance. Like, I know we kind of talked about it there with that, but expanding on the success stories, can you tell us how, like, any big ways that culturalization has not only opened up a new market or maybe possibly averted, big giant cultural conflicts or anything?
Yeah, there's times where you have to make hard decisions about what you want to do as a creator and as a company, and a lot of times that's why in recent years I've been giving talks that focus not just on culturalization but on your values and how your values as a creator and as a company or organization influence what you want to create and influence the decisions that you make. China being the largest film market and the largest gaming market in the world, as most people know, China has some pretty interesting restrictions on what they are willing to show or not show in their content. And so a lot of companies have to make a really hard choice there and say, well, do we want to bend over backwards to make a version for China that we know is not going to be compatible probably with a lot of other places of the world? So it's a lot of effort. Are we going to go make all that effort so we can sell our game in China, which typically has to be done through a local Chinese company as a partner? It's not just something you can go in and do yourself. Or are we just going to focus focused on the rest of the world and not worry about China. And more recently, with China becoming more and more strict about some of the things that they're allowing, and especially with political and social overtones, there's a lot of companies I've been seeing which are kind of based on their values, especially companies more in the West, where they have leaned very heavily into inclusivity and diversity and wanting to be, very inclusive of all kinds of people from walks of life and from different demographics. Once China declared back in 2019 that they did not want to see LGBTQ representation in games, that was kind of a deal breaker for a lot of companies, where they were just like, okay, that's it. Then we're not even going to try to sell into China, because to make a version for China under those conditions directly violates what we consider to be some of our core values as creators, to be inclusive. And so, that's one of those things where oftentimes it's a bit of a challenge for the company, because they can see the revenue sitting out there in a certain market, but they have to make that crucial decision to say,
Right.
that's revenue that we are not going to chase, because it's
too
going to,
far.
it's going to
Not
cross a
worth
line.
the effort to change the values drastically enough to go collect that.
Yeah. And I mean, I can show another example along these lines.
Sure.
This happened a while back with Age of Empires. And again, this is a pretty well documented example, so it's not like I'm showing anything that's unknown. But basically, this is a good example of what's going on back in the day when Microsoft was growing its gaming business back in the 90s. And they basically knew that they wanted to go as many places as possible, because they're creating a whole new vertical for themselves. Starting with PC games, they already had Flight Sim, but then they of course built on that with other games like Age of Empires. And so the first Age of Empires had this scenario in the game, which is from the Middle Ages. And so you're playing as the Chosun Empire in Korea over on the left in red. And what history tells us really happened, is that the Japanese invaded the Chosun Empire and almost completely took it over. And so you see Japan in blue. And so they made an invasion over to the Korean Peninsula and almost took it over. However, so basically that's the scenario that was put in the game, because the developers said, hey, if you play as the Chosun Empire, what a great scenario, because it's like a very difficult level to win, because you've got this overwhelming Japanese force coming at you. So how are you supposed to win this battle? They said that's a great scenario for a game. That's why they put it in the game. Well, the game was released in South Korea, and the game was banned in South Korea because of this. Because the Ministry of Information in Korea said that this never happened. And they actually meant that, historically speaking, their history teaches that this did not happen, that Japan did not have an overwhelming invasion of the Chosun Empire. And it did basically because, as is the role of the Korean Ministry of Information, they are protecting the image of Korea, and they felt that this doesn't reflect well on the Korean history. And so they basically said we're not allowing the game to release with this particular scenario. So now we're faced with a hard decision. It's like, what are we supposed to do? Because again, we're trying to grow the business, it would create a new vertical. And the important thing is that market research told us that South Korea is an extremely important gaming market. And it is. I mean, it is an extremely important gaming market even to this day. And so basically we felt like we had no choice but to modify the scenario, because we wanted to release the game. It was too difficult to just like take it out completely. So what we did instead was modify the scenario, and the modification essentially was changing history. So now, instead of Japan invading Korea, Korea is now invading Japan, which did not happen. As far as we're aware, that did not happen back in those days with the Chosun Empire. Now, as you can imagine, this created a lot of conversation on the development team about the nature of truth and ethics, because we are serving government propaganda.
To your own facts, I can imagine, is kind of like the question that came up.
Yeah. Because we are now a vehicle for serving up government propaganda in the South Korean market, and that is how people characterized it. The people on the team, and they're not incorrect, but it is a business decision that had to be made, because this was essentially the only way that we were going to release this game in South Korea, and it was only for South Korean players who saw this. Everywhere else in the world, they saw the scenario on the top. I also had to remind people, though, when we were making this decision about changing history, that a few years earlier, when I was working on Encarta Encyclopedia, in the French and Italian versions of the encyclopedia, we had different heights for the mountain Mont Blanc that sits on their border, because at the time the two governments disagreed on the height of the mountain by just a few centimeters. And because an encyclopedia is an educational resource, it has to conform to local educational standards. And the standards meant that the mountain was different heights in the two different countries. So we had to change the height of the mountain in two different language versions in order to sell those products into those markets. So this is not that different from that. It's a little more blatant because it's an actual historical scenario. But whether it's a physical mountain that we're changing the size of, or we're changing something that happened in time, the issue's the same. Is that you are making a modification, consciously modifying the product in a way that is making an alternate version of reality, and which is not unlike what we're seeing in a lot of media spaces today anyway. But the important part of all of this, of course, is the fact that we did it very, very consciously. We weren't just we weren't being haphazard or careless about this. We thought this through and all the implications of this very, very carefully, and decided to go ahead and make the decision that we made.
Awesome. Those examples perfectly set up, almost a segue in and of themselves for the next discussion that I wanted to have, which is, out of all those anecdotes and out of all the experience, and, you mentioned Encarta, you mentioned, several games that you've worked on and very cool things. Is there any practical generic advice you can have for game developers? Are there any tips you can offer developers looking to integrate culturalization into their projects? Practical steps that can bridge those gaps, or any guidance who might be, even for the small independent one-off people that might be, listening to this podcast and coding their own game?
Yeah, absolutely. And that tends to be one of the biggest questions I get whenever I give a lecture, is like, well, how do I do this?
How do I do this?
Because,
how do I get that encyclopedic knowledge, literally Encarta encyclopedic knowledge that you developed?
I mean, I'm just fortunate that I actually worked on an encyclopedia, so that helped. I mean, plus it's built upon my foundation as a geographer, which also tremendously helps, because geography is all about studying the difference based on where. So why are things different between place to place? And that kind of method of thinking and that approach to the world fit very, very well with a business environment in which it's all about market to market differences. And so I found that the way that I approach problems as a geographer really synced up very well with people trying to solve these problems, and how do we deliver different kind of content to different markets. But for most people who don't have that background, which is most people, the main thing of course, the biggest challenge of all is just pure awareness, which is exactly what we're doing right now. The fact that you understand that these kind of differences do exist and that you have to be mindful of it is, frankly, it really is half the battle. Because oftentimes a lot of the projects I've worked on, and at this point I've worked on over 275 games in my 31 plus years in the industry, and on a lot of these projects, it's just the awareness piece that people need to have to understand choices they're making. Not just about being kind of like, well, I'm just going to make this, I'm going to make that, and just be very intentional about every single thing you do. The other thing that's really important is that if you know that you're going to use a design that's from the real world, which tends to happen a lot, from a specific culture or from a specific area of the world, just do your part to if your game is going to be representing that real place, that's totally fine. Then the challenge is accuracy. It's not about allegory. It's about, you need to be accurate, make sure that you're representing it correctly. And that's where you really need to get the input of people who are local. You can ask them, you can reach out to people in your community, especially if you're an indie game developer. I mean, there's countless communities like the Global Game Jam community and the IGDA and all these other communities where you can connect with people from different cultures around the world. I mean, it's one of the great advantages of the world we live in today, is being able to do that. I encourage you to reach out to people and see if you can get somebody from that culture who can help kind of guide you They don't have to be a professional sociologist or anthropologist or anything. I mean, that's great too. You can go to a local university and get advice from professors. That also is something I would advise. But just getting the input of somebody who's from the culture is the most minimal bar that you need to meet. Especially today, so many games and so many creators like to leverage different artifacts and artistic elements from indigenous cultures. And that's where the huge cultural appropriation problem comes in, where you have to be extremely careful about that. I mean, there are so many phenomenal designs that exist throughout indigenous cultures around the world. And I understand why people are so attracted to borrowing them, especially because for a lot of people, these designs are new and they're fresh and there's something that's really unique. And that's all great. But again, you have to be extremely careful about leveraging anything from those cultures. And you need to get it with the blessing of the people from that culture and get their input on this. And fortunately, a lot of game companies today have been doing that, especially, there's a lot of great examples where there's collaborations between, the company and the team and people from that culture. I mean, Assassin's Creed has done this several times with a lot of the narratives that they're creating. But then, it's just a matter of making sure that, you be respectful about the approach. I mean, like, for example, one of the games I'm working on right now is the Indiana Jones game that comes out later this year. And one of the things that I've done is they've sourced through me a couple of archaeologists from different parts of the world who are helping guide them on the accuracy and authenticity of the sites that they're putting into the game, because the game takes place in the real world, and they want to make sure that the artifacts and the art and everything that is being represented in the game is completely accurate for the time period. And so it's just been an absolute blast to work with these archaeologists as we're working on the game together. Plus, I'm a huge Indiana Jones geek, so that alone has been fun. So.
Amanda, so that's cool. Well, I appreciate you sharing all that advice. Along with that advice, we have collected some burning questions
Nice.
ourselves.
Yes.
So I'm going to see. So I'm going to scroll through, and I asked Eileen to put these questions into the captions, so we're going to have to kind of coordinate which ones I pick and if she grabs the right questions. So it should be a fun little game internally with us with our visualizations. But I think the first thing that I want to ask is going to be maybe what's the, like, with your company or with your consulting process, what is the first step like in the culturalization process when you receive a new project?
That's a great question. I would say that usually what happens, I mean, it depends on the nature of the request, because I will get requests that happen through all different stages of a game's life cycle. Hopefully it's not one of the requests that comes at the end of the life cycle or after release where they're all in a panic because something they did is causing a lot of backlash. That does happen, but more typically what happens is I will be approached by a company, say, hey, we've got an idea for a game we're working on, or we're working on the next version of a game that's already out, or whatever the case may be. And we're going to create like this new group or this new faction, or we're going to have a narrative that deals with this particular topic, et cetera, et cetera. And we would really like your guidance on how we walk through this carefully. And so that's really what it's about. And so what often happens is I will take an initial look at the content in question, whether it's a very specific like level they're designing or a character design or something, or in some cases, like for example, I've worked on all the BioWare games since Jade Empire. So that's a lot of games. I'm currently finishing up work on Dragon Age Dreadwolf right now. And so with the BioWare games, I'm involved like right from the start, all the way through the process. I look at the initial draft of the script, look at the concept art, kind of give guidance very early, because for culturalization, which is a huge difference with localization, with culturalization, the earlier I can provide that advice, the more useful it's going to be. And of course, it's a lot easier to make changes when you're early in the project versus later. Whereas localization, because they have to do language translation, they often have to wait till later in the product cycle so that the content, all the text is complete, so that then they can actually do the translation without having to change it. So that's a huge difference. So essentially, the earlier I'm brought onto a project, the better for the project. And that's typically what happens, but not always.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
perfect. So, going back to Indiana Jones, you said you're a really good fan to the show. And I want to know, how do you balance creative freedom and cultural sensitivity, especially in games that aim to provide historical and cultural representations?
Yeah, that is an awesome question, because that is really kind of the core, I would say, not debate. I would just say the core conversation that happens on a lot of these games is, in fact, I'm having that conversation right now with one of my clients about, they feel the pressure to do things a certain way to satisfy a broader audience, but it's not what they want to do, because they have a very specific creative vision for what they want to do. And I tell them, basically, you have to be true to your creative vision, because that's why you're doing what you're doing, and I'm the last person who would say, you can't follow your creative heart and do what you want to do, because I do think very strongly that games, they are free speech and they should be allowed to address any kind of topic, even if it's very controversial. But it's all about, that's fine, and you as a creator can make that choice. But then it's about, are you really trying to find a market for your game? Do you want to sell your game? And that's where it comes into being a challenge. Because if you don't care about making money, then games can be pure art, just like somebody who paints a painting and puts it on a wall. They don't care if anyone likes it or not. It's their self-expression, and that's totally fine. But finding the balance between wanting to express yourself and being creative, but also wanting to increase the exposure of your content and make money off of it. Because let's face it, most people who make games are in this to make a living off it. They want to pay their bills and have a roof over their head and all those good things. So basically that's the balance we have to constantly struggle with. And sometimes I get projects that come to me for advice, and they almost want me to figure that out for them. And I'm like, I can't answer that question for you. That's only you can answer the question about how creative you want to be,
where you draw the line, right?
Where you draw the line. I mean, some companies like Rockstar is a good example, who makes Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption and all these other phenomenal games. They basically at this point really don't care, because they had been so vilified as the creators of Grand Theft Auto back in the 90s and 2000s, because Grand Theft Auto was like,
what else are they going to say about us? We're going to tell the story we want to tell. Right.
Yeah, and so they basically leaned into the fact that we're going to do whatever we want to do.
The bad boys.
Yeah,
bad boys of video games.
Kind of, yeah.
Rockstar.
That's essentially what they did. And but because their games have been so ridiculously successful, that gives them a lot of financial leeway to be that way. Gotcha. Not most game companies don't have that kind of war chest of money
to pull from. Like they have to find the next success, whereas they're kind of able to do it because of that buffer. Let's call it a success buffer. Exactly. Well, I've got a question for you. I'm curious, out of what I think you mentioned 30 years plus, or I did, or someone did, out of all that time, what project, looking back, are you most proud of that dealt in terms of the culturalization work, and why are you most proud of it?
Wow, that's a great question. One of the ones that I've worked on all the Age of Empires games, and I'm really proud of the work I've done on that. We do a lot of incredible detailed due diligence on those games. I worked on all the original games 20 something years ago, and I'm currently working on, I was brought back a few years ago to work on Age of Empires 4, and then I still do a lot of work on the DLC for the Age of Empires series, 2, 3, and 4. And that's just been a really a joyful product to work on. I really love working on those games because it's like that perfect blend of history and fiction. I mean, because it is somewhat fictionalized history, but there is a commitment though to being true to what really happened on the ground, and to be as objective as we can be about it. And to be able to tell historical stories from different sides. Like I think the Rise of the Sultans campaign that came out a few months ago for Age of Empires 4 was super cool because it basically tells the story of the Crusades, but from the Arab point of view, which has been a point of view that we've really not seen. So now it's about you defending your homeland against these weird European rich guys coming in wanting to claim your land and call it the Holy Land, and so changing that perspective around, which is a very valid view of history, just from a different side of the issue. I think it was great to see, and so being able to be involved with that is super cool. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done on Age of Empires. It's over the years, I think consistently the franchise has done extremely well.
Culturalization work, maybe for a franchise overall. You think?
I think so.
Like I think the most attention to the product.
I think so. And I mean, yeah, there's been a few hiccups now and then over the years. I mean, I pointed that Korean one out earlier, but but for the most part, I mean, it's just the amount of work we put into that to make sure that we're being as respectful to the history is pretty tremendous, and it's a lot of fun to work on.
Well, speaking of Age of Empires, before we go on to another question, have you heard about the recent news from last week of the guy that was implanted with Elon Musk's company's Neuralink, that then, like, the next day after he healed, spent like 8 hours. He's a paraplegic. He can't use anything. 8 hours playing. I think might have been Civilization, which I know is a competing product. I can't remember if it was
well,
Age
I've worked
of
on
Empires
that
or
too.
Civilization, but I know he spent like an all-nighter staying up all night. Can't move any of his muscles, playing with this Neuralink, from Elon Musk's company. I know that news broke last week, and I was like, "Wow, that's amazing!"
That's cool.
Like you can get something like that back, because it is. I'm a big fan of the Civ, the Sid Meier's, Civ series, also Age of Empires. All those kind of games have been ever since I can remember having a computer in the mid '90s.
Yeah.
Dating myself as well. I'm not quite in the 50 club, but almost. But yeah. Anyway, on a side note, just wanted to kind of mention that.
That's cool.
That's kind of a cool thing that's happening now, is neural linking capability to control things for gaming, which is kind of a unique thing.
That's pretty cool. Especially, I don't know, someday maybe that means, can you play a game like 10 times faster? Because you don't have to use your hands.
I mean, I would imagine like easy for a Civ game, but like I wonder how that would work once it's calibrated enough to be able to do like first person shooters and stuff. You can just have thought. Thought playing, like Anyway. Go ahead, Eileen. Ask a question.
Well, yes, I have another question. And now looking ahead to the future, maybe with the global game market evolving, how do you see the role of the culturalization strategies changing in the new decade?
Well, I think that it is going to continue to evolve for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure that comes with this role. Like you said, it is a minefield, and the world is not getting more and more peaceful either. And so, every geopolitical event has to be examined in terms of the content choices that we're making. I mean, the invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago sent shockwaves to the industry in terms of what we were supposed to do with Russian-facing content and Ukraine-related content, and not just in the games, but also the teams themselves, because the industry has used a lot of amazing Ukrainian talent. And so we had to adjust to that as well, and support them in kind of reconfiguring how they're going to work. And then what's happening, in Israel and Gaza right now is also,
the past 6 months hasn't brought any further ease to the industry.
It hasn't.
Culturalization.
Yeah, I mean, that too has caused some issues. Like, I mean, I'm working on an expansion of a first-person shooter game right now, and the expansion takes place in Latin America, and yet the visuals look like it is could be the Middle East. And so we had to make a lot of steps and take a lot of additional effort to make sure that the environment, the map that's being created for this particular level is not perceived as the Middle East. And so we had to dress up the environment to do other additional things in the environment to make sure that people understand that this is not Gaza, it is not Israel. Please do not perceive it that way. Right. And it was a choice that had been made.
That's a big challenge, especially with it being so present in everybody's mind.
Oh yeah,
and the boots on the ground, reality stuff happening.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that comes with this job, that is only going to get more challenging, is trying to help people anticipate what those issues could be. So that is part of the work that I do, which kind of dovetails really well with my background as a geographer, is that I am looking ahead in the different markets on the games that I work on. When I have an understanding of when the game is potentially going to release, I have to look ahead and see what content in the game could be problematic 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 2 years from now, based on what I know is happening in those different markets. And so, because as we know, all it takes is one election or one regime change in a certain market, and the content rules can suddenly be completely different. And that's something we have to be really on top of. And so I think that, along with the fact that social media continues to fragment reality and cause these perceptual barriers between people, is only making this job harder.
I was
it
going to
really
ask,
is.
without getting too political or upsetting any factions, I have kind of a follow-up question. Are you experiencing, especially with Ukraine and more recently with the Israel-Hamas, Israel-Gaza situation, are you finding? So I understand the corporate shift and the reasons why corporations would want to be careful. Are you finding the corporations are like because I see, especially with young people, a shift in the political perceptions, maybe of your and my generations, where things were just default, pro a certain side or whatever. Especially in the youth, like them rejecting all of those things for their own interpretations, which I personally kind of align with. I don't want to get into the details, but do you find the changing populace has an impact on having the corporations also kind of go with them because that's where the market is? Or do you think corporations are just sticking with what they know? Like what are you feeling as these political winds are shifting, especially on these age demographics, as it seems?
Well, I think you touched upon the very tension that a lot of companies are dealing with, is because a lot of these companies are not being run by people who are of the consumer generation. Right. They're being run by people like us who are from a different generation. My generation. I mean, I remember duck and cover drills in elementary school because I grew up during the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was evil. And that's the world that I grew up in. And of course, by the time that all fell apart in the early 90s, I was already, almost done with college at that point. I mean, in fact, I started working at Microsoft the year after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, that whole way that the different generational difference of perceiving and adhering to different levels of truth or not adhering to truth or deciding essentially what they want to believe in terms of being black and white or just a grayness of truth value is a huge factor in this. And it is influencing a lot of, and it's actually causing a lot of companies to really struggle with how they respond to things, which is why I think you see a lot of companies take a far more cautious approach when it comes to any of these issues, because to be quite frank, I would say, more than some percentage of the clients I work with, probably more than half, they do this work and they embrace culturalization because they truly want to deliver content that respects the local customer and respects the local player. But the other group, the other contingent, does it because they are absolutely terrified of social media. They are petrified of what's going to happen. And I think that a lot of that comes from a misunderstanding or not enough fluency in understanding the younger generations and how they use social media for activism. And so they do not want to be canceled. They don't want to be called out for something that they did in their game or their product. And so they're just terrified of that. And so they'll do the right thing, but that's why they do the right thing. It's not because they actually might believe the right thing is the right thing to do. It's because they don't want to be canceled. But that is changing. I mean, to me, that's progress, because even if they're doing the right thing, regardless of the reason, that's great. I'm happy for that. But I feel like part of my job is, as I work with these companies, over time, is to kind of get them around the corner to understand that you're actually doing the right thing for the right reasons. You don't have to live in fear of this. You can actually stay ahead of this and do it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that. Makes a lot of sense. Well, I think that's enough questions. So what I would like to know, Let's see. So where I'd like to go from here is first, I would like to share some personal anecdote about something related to this. So as Kate has kind of mentioned, she's a geographer, map maker of sorts. She's also one of the leaders of a very interesting app called SetJetters. And I downloaded this app a few months back once I met Kate at an event and was so impressed. I love this app, SetJetters. I'm actually going to put up a QR code for folks in case you want to check this. So, number one, I will tell you that you can notice that this is a photo of Kate at a Star Wars location.
Yes.
And in case you didn't notice, she's also joining us from the Millennium Falcon. I don't know if y'all picked that up, but her background, at least I think it's the Millennium
Yes,
Falcon.
it is.
Looks like the cargo hold.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm also a Star Wars nerd. Kate has shared in her talk that she's a Star Wars nerd. So I figured that was it. So, Kate, let's talk about SetJetters. First, I kind of want to share. I had a corporate meeting with a company I work for. Mm-hmm. It was in Atlanta at a lake house on Lake Lanier in Georgia. And I was there and I was like, telling them about SetJetters because, we do app development. I'm like, hey, y'all should check out this app, and zooming in like all around where we were, and actually kept it. So zoomed in and was able to find all the Ozark sets that were like within a mile of the thing. And I was actually went and saw the house from Ozarks. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love this SetJetters app. This is like my new favorite thing. So with that being said, I was in a place and I could like look on the map and it had all these little photo icons of like different things you could do around. Now that's my plus. And then I want you to tell me about SetJetters because I love it. I uploaded a profile. And then once you tell me about it, I'm going to tell you the thing that I didn't like, but that I'm going to be a contributor for.
Great.
But go ahead. Tell us about SetJetters and what made you decide to do this other than your Star Wars fandom.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of the footnote to my Star Wars fandom is that I was 12 years old when the original came out, which had a huge impact on my generation and all of us who were around that age. And I actually, one of my aspirations after high school was to be a conceptual artist for Lucasfilm so I could work on a Star Wars film. That never happened, but I did pursue it for a few years. But then I actually ended up working on Star Wars The Old Republic video game for 4 years with BioWare. So the circle was now complete. I did get to work on something Star Wars eventually. But SetJetters came about because I have been a lifelong film location nerd. I grew up in Southern California where you're just surrounded by filming locations everywhere. And I was such a huge fan of the show MASH. Well, I still am. But back when I was in high school, I actually, with one of my friends, we crashed the set of MASH while they were filming the last season of the show back in the summer of 1982 in Malibu Creek State Park, where they filmed the outdoor set. And so we crashed the set the day they were filming. And so they let us stay. We're just a couple of dumb high school kids. They took sympathy on us and let us stick around and watch the filming for the day. And we got to meet Mike Farrell and some of the other actors of the show. So it was like this magical experience, this thing that I love on the screen. I'm actually standing in the place where that becomes alive and becomes captured, and that kind of set off for me this real fascination with filming locations and set jetting as a hobby. So for all the travel I do, which is about 75% of the year, I'm out there somewhere in the world. A lot of times I spend time visiting filming locations. Like even this week, by the end of this week, I'll be in Dubrovnik to speak at the Reboot conference. But Dubrovnik, of course, is one of the key locations for Game of Thrones. And so I've visited a lot of the filming locations for Game of Thrones there. So I've been doing this for decades, but then just shortly before COVID, so like late 2019, some of my colleagues approached me who I know from the film industry, and they had an idea for making a television series about filming locations, but which is actually something we're still working on. But then because of COVID, there wasn't going to be any filming being done of any kind. So they approached me and said, hey, you work in tech, do you know anything about making an app? And I'm like, yes, I do. So that was basically when I was brought into the project as a co-founder. and the chief experience officer, because I was the one on the team out of us 5 founders who had been doing this activity for so long. So basically I created the experience and have kind of helped define what the user experience is for people who use this app. And we just wanted to facilitate and to essentially share the joy with people of film tourism and set jetting. And to me, what it's really about is creating that emotional, basically enabling the emotional connection that you feel between the media that you love and the place where it was filmed. Because as an example, when I was in Tunisia to speak a few years ago, I went to southern Tunisia where they filmed the original Star Wars, the Lars homestead. That the house, Luke Skywalker's house, is still there, or I should say it's Uncle Owen's house, but whatever. But it's still there. And fans every few years they go there and they restore it because it is on a lake bed, so it does get eroded every once in a while. But when I first visited, it was like a religious experience because that film has meant so much to me and was so influential on my life that to be there in that place where they filmed that movie over 40 years ago, I mean, I was weak in the knees. I was tearing up because I could not believe that I was there. And that really is what it's about for a lot of people. And we've heard story after story of people who use the app and who are really into film tourism, where they tell us that the app is enabling them to connect in a way with the media that means so much to them. Plus, it's also just fun. It's fun to go
it's
because
totally fun.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, it's like a gamified experience. So you get badges for how many places you visit, and there's different things you can unlock. And it was a lot of fun. I had my 15-year-old with.
We've lost him.
And then I told him, I'm like, hey, you know that place we're staying this weekend is where they filmed Ozarks. And he's like, Ozarks, what's that? And I'm like, oh my gosh, now we got to watch it. So I'm showing him, so it was a way for, even with my family, to like get him engaged with the show that he wouldn't normally be interested in.
Mhm.
But because of the proximity, and now I'm going to come to my other point. So I noticed that first, let me say, I'm an old film buff. Didn't have cable growing up in the Atlanta area. Actually, my hometown is Jonesboro, Georgia. And if you know anything about the history of film, you know that Jonesboro, Georgia is the site of Margaret Mitchell's Terra. Probably the largest film ever in the 1930s. Yes, it has racial overtones that are problematic for the time, pre-Jim Crow, all that. But as a piece of film, it was filmed in my hometown, of Atlanta and of Jonesboro. And so I noticed that a lot of your sites are, let's say, more modern.
Yes.
I didn't see a lot of like classic golden age MGM.
Yeah.
But the cool thing about the app is you're able to contribute. And so being a Jonesboro boy, being for the person who is from Terra and Gone with the Wind, I'm definitely going to be, next time I'm in Jonesboro, I'm going to be submitting some awesome stuff. In fact, I reached out to a guy that does the Terra tour. And the Terra facade of the house is stored in a dairy barn near Atlanta. Anyway, I'm very connected to Gone with the Wind and the story because of my hometown. Awesome. So I'm going to be adding some content to Set Jetters with a more classically filmed thing in mind, because most of my deep film love is pre-1950, Singing in the Rain, all that kind of stuff. While most of it was done on sound stages, there were some like Gone with the Wind that were just so spectacularly large that they had the budgets of modern epics and they were actually filmed out on places.
Oh yeah.
But anyway.
No, I think that's awesome because when we started the app, obviously we kind of leaned into like big franchises just to kind of brought up Marvel and Harry Potter and James Bond and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, we have been slowly adding, and like you said, people can add, they can submit scenes to add. And we get a lot of submissions now. We get at least 50 a month from our user base, which is fantastic because a lot of times it's the very thing that you mentioned. They're like, well, I'm from this place and I know they filmed this movie here or that movie
this
there.
restaurant was in this movie, and it's all the local lore, especially. So I imagine I'll be adding a lot of that. But.
Yeah, which is awesome because and especially older films too, because we're like I added all the scenes from Lawrence of Arabia because that's one of my favorite films.
Oh, great film.
So and I've been to some of the locations, but I mean we're more and more adding older films as well as newer stuff, and also independent films too, because we're trying to cover everything eventually, not just all the big stuff.
That's totally cool. Well, I definitely want to be a contributor, and I suggest everybody out there in the world download Set Jetters. It is a great little piece of UI, UX mapping, awesomeness. You will not be disappointed. If you've never been a set tourist, which I didn't know was a thing until I met Kate. Like I had been to sets because I'm a filmmaker and an independent filmmaker, and I like, but it never crossed my mind that it was a thing until I heard her tell her stories, and I was like, oh my gosh, I now want to go do that. I want to be a set tourist. But not only that, this app makes it like so dumb and easy. Like you just open up the map. It shows you, hey, within, right here in your neighborhood, there's this, that, or the other. I was just amazed at all the stuff that was filmed around Atlanta that you all did capture, because I happen to be in Atlanta. And of course, I'm in San Jose and Santa Cruz, and anywhere you go, you can find those little 3 or 4 places that are on the route. You can stop by lunch next to them and collect your badge and, get a photo for your social media. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. I really appreciate you bringing it to the world.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate you sharing it with us today. And, maybe we'll have to do a whole nother episode dedicated to set jetters.
That'd be fun.
And I appreciate you coming today. Anything that you'd like to share with our audience or anything in kind of closing?
I think again, thank you so much for having me here. I mean, it's great to talk about these topics. I mean, culturalization is not, on the surface, it sounds easy, but as I think people have come to understand watching this, is it's not necessarily a straightforward or easy process, but that's actually why I love it. And I love the work that I do because I am insatiably curious about so many things. And as I work on projects, from project to project, I get to learn constantly from the other experts that I work hand in hand with to help make the content, to be culturally compatible around the world as much as possible. If that's the goal of the company. If it isn't, well, that's fine too. But, I do what I can. So I'm always happy to connect with people. If they want to connect with me on LinkedIn, if they have any follow-up questions, I'm more than happy to
put a QR code on our screen for Kate's LinkedIn. If you want to grab it, you can see it there. We'll also put links in the description, and Kate has promised to provide some other resources related to her conversation today. So not today, but maybe by next week, if you check the description on this video, especially on YouTube and some more other platforms, you should be able to see a bunch of cool links to Kate's work. But at least right now, you can connect with her on LinkedIn. And again, if you have any questions about culturalization in games, but not even just in games, in all apps and all software, as she mentioned earlier, please reach out to Kate. She is probably the world's encyclopedic source for that kind of information. She can certainly steer you in the right direction. And Kate, from me and Eileen, I really do appreciate you joining us today. Hold on, let me get the QR code out of the way. Really do appreciate you joining us, taking the time. It was a great episode, and I look forward to talking to you in the future and finding more movie sets to visit.
Great.
As I do my own travels.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you very much, Kate. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Kate. You have a great day. We'll see you all next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
From the heart of Silicon Valley, San Jose, California, and broadcast worldwide. Velocity 7 Studios and Team V7 are proud to present the Elite Geeks Podcast. Stay tuned for an impactful lowdown featuring today's most incredible change makers. Now, here's your host, Roland Bao.